Let me try that again then. For those of you watching on the live stream, you may not have heard that. I would like to welcome you to this hybrid event on the next term, what role for the EU, what role for insurance on behalf of GDV. You're going to hear from your host in just a moment, but just a couple of housekeeping points first. My name is Jackie Davis. I'll be moderating our discussion this evening, and we're going to have an interactive panel after an introduction to our conversation. If during our panel you want to ask a question, you'll be very welcome to do so. Please raise your hand in the old-fashioned way, those of you in the room, and I will come to you with the mic. And if you wish to engage on social media, get messages out from what you are hearing today, we do encourage you to do so. Please use the hashtag GDV Brussels. And now it is my great pleasure to give the floor to Lenka de Mauro, Head of European and International Affairs at GDV, to introduce the event and welcome you more formally. Over to you, Lenka.
Thank you. Thank you, Jackie. Dear speakers, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to welcome you all to our today's event, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation. For once, it is not insurance we want to talk in the first place. Today, we put the focus on the event of the year in Brussels and hopefully in all over Europe, the European elections. European elections that follow a legislature of substantial shifts of perspectives, focus and priorities. First, the rollout of the Green Deal, aiming at a comprehensive redirection of European economy onto the path of green transition. Then the pandemic, partially paralyzing Europe and the world for months and for years. Followed by the blood-freezing awakenings on the 24th of February 2022 and 7 October 2023. This sequence of events meant priorities shifting from coping with climate change to still coping with climate change, but at the same time helping Europeans to overcome the health and later the economic crisis. To making Europe more self-sufficient, but not disconnected. To becoming green without relying on cheap transition energies. To becoming economically and militarily more resilient. And eventually also to becoming more resilient as a society after the vast rise of anti-Semitism and extremist ideologies all over Europe. In most of that, the EU has played an unusually tangible role for European citizens, for the good or for the bad, as some might argue. In any case, it should be more present in the minds of European citizens than ever before. But will it be enough for us to see the value of the EU in this global setting? Will it be enough for the people to realize that we cannot afford the EU vote to be a protest vote? Will it be enough to see its strengths, but also its weaknesses, and to draw the necessary conclusions? The polls and mood in many member states are rather sobering in that respect. I am very curious to hear the take of our panelists on these questions, and I would add a few more. Do we need a new focus in the next term, a treaty change? And if that is politically not feasible, then what change is desirable and which one is in reach? Without going into too much detail and leaving the discussion on the possible big changes to the panel, I'd like to mention a few observations we would have on the current way of adopting European legislation. In particular, but not only, in view of the very present discussion on deepening of the Capital Markets Union and the Single Market, as ahead of any term, by the way, I think it is important to recognize that there are limits to what can be achieved through European legislation due to the current division of powers between the EU and the national level. The further development of the CMU might require effective coordination between member states and the Commission in areas like taxation or insolvency law, the strongholds of national competence, so to say. What we would therefore wish for is that the political ambition to work on these important projects goes hand in hand with a thorough assessment whether any new proposed measure would really make a difference and have a clear net positive effect. And this net positive effect of new legislative proposals, regardless in which field, should entail the competitiveness check to which the Commission committed some months ago. And we hope that this commitment shows material results and will not become a mere expression of intention or a box-ticking exercise. Then there is the much-discussed reporting burden reduction or cutting red tape more in general. Well, cutting is good, but preventing unnecessary burdens or red tape from the outset is much better. To that end, we have several suggestions. For example, we would like to see horizontal structures introduced in the Commission Directorates General that would ensure, through regular exchange and coordination, that the cumulative effect of a sectorial and horizontal legislation on one sector, such as insurance, is recognized in time and assessed properly. On the other hand, cutting red tape in a supranational structure is only possible if both the European and the national level work together. We consider it very important that the Commission and national governments engage in discussions on how to achieve this goal together. For example, by committing not to legislate on the same matters in parallel, by eliminating gold plating of European rules and dropping old and outdated provisions. And cutting red tape would, in our view, also require that the legislative cycle gets less intense. 2 short review periods for level 1 legislation combined with level 2 measures that too often are adopted just a few weeks before application means that considerable business capacities are needed to adapt to new rules regularly with no time to prepare. And last but not least, we would encourage the Commission to further step up its efforts on the international level in order to win like-minded actors for common goals of global dimension, which would not only help to achieve these goals, but also help European businesses to keep and increase their competitiveness. But the elections for sure will not be decided only on global issues or the capacity of the EU to reform. Societal challenges like the cost of living crisis, growing risk of old age poverty due to demographic change, the threat of ever more frequent and severe natural disasters, new opportunities but also new risks arising from digitalization, the need to compete with players that not always play by the same rules, and to raise capital for the digital and green transition, as well as to attract skilled workforce, might be closer to the heart of European citizens and businesses. Some of them require mainly national solutions, but many have a European dimension, and in most of them insurers play a role, either as providers of risk coverage or as large institutional investors. As new risks arise and certain risks become more extreme, insurers look for new approaches and solutions in order to respond to the needs of the society and their customers. At the same time, we are increasingly confronted with the wish to insure more, using less data, or restricting the use of certain technologies, however high EU data protection and anti-discrimination standards are. The next term promises to bring interesting discussions in this very respect. And to conclude, I would like to sum up the reasons why we hold this event today. First, we want to express our commitment to democratic values and our rejection of any extremist ideologies that seek to undermine the basis on which our society and the Union are built, namely the protection of human rights. Second, with this event, we want to make our small contribution to raising awareness of the importance of these elections and of democratic participation in general. And third, we want to make it unmistakably clear that with all the criticism we might have on reporting burdens, red tape, or disproportionate requirements, this far from perfect union is also far too good to be called into question and worth any effort to be improved. With this, I give over to you, Jackie, and I very much look forward to the panel and this discussion to come.
Thank you very much indeed, Lenka. So as Lenka very eloquently described there, our focus this evening very much first on those European elections. What is at stake? What will be the issues that matter to voters when they go to the polls? What might the outcome mean for Europe? What might the new parliament look like, and what implications will that have for the EU's capacity to act? But I do hope also towards the end of our discussion to come back to what all of this means in terms of the role insurers in this debate. I am delighted to welcome, please do come and join me as I introduce you, Sergej Lagodinsky, MEP from the Group of Greens and the European Free Alliance, who is Vice Chair of the European Parliament's Legal Affairs Committee. Sergej, thank you so much for coming. René Rapace, MEP from the Socialist Socialists and Democrats group and a member of the Committee on the Internal Market and Consumer Protection, Antonios Nestoras, who is Deputy Director of the European Liberal Forum. So that gives us 3 political perspectives on the issues we're discussing. And to bring us more academic, neutral perspective, delighted to welcome Corinna Stratulat, Associate Director and Head of the European Politics and Institutions Programme at the European Policy Centre. So I have some questions for our panel, and then, as I say, later on, I will come out to all of you. And before we begin to delve into the elections, what the outcome might be, what sort of issues you think, and then this question of the EU's capacity to act, I'd just like to get your assessment, Sergei, at this moment, of geopolitical tensions, of the shocks that Lenka was talking about. How would you assess the challenge we face and the capacity of the EU to respond to that challenge right now?
Well, that's already a question for a whole panel. The challenge that we're facing is huge, is enormous. We're just coming from the Munich Security Conference, where this has become very clear that this is a challenge that actually, in many cases, overstretches our mental capacity, not just our capacities, but there are not so many visions and ideas on how to, where do we want to go as Europe, and how to design this path. I am optimistic that we will be able to find it, but this is a process. And that process must be organized, and this will be the challenge that we will be facing.
So you believe that before we have conversations about the EU's powers, the tools it needs, you need to start with the vision. Where are we trying to go? And that debate needs to be had again.
Well, the vision of, first of all, I don't think that people in the policy realm realize the magnitude of the shifts and the transformation that we are experiencing in the world. I think that in the world of global economy, people are more aware of the acuteness of what is going on. Because you do have, if you're talking about the chains, supply chains, then automatically you have the whole world in your view. If you're sitting here and we're discussing about not less important issues of social issues and climate issues, we sometimes tend to look at our continent only. We need to combine both. And I think this will be the challenge on how to see the reality of this new world we're living in and to integrate it into our transformation agenda.
And René, it was quite striking. The word Zeitenwende, a German word, entered the EU lexicon after the start of the Ukraine war. You don't hear so much talk of it now. We seem to have gone back so everyone talked about it as a wake-up moment. Has it really been? How would you assess the challenge for the EU now and our capacity to respond to that challenge?
It's basically very close to what Sergei was saying. What he was outlining is basically the foundation of Zeitenwende. It's also good that we have this word here instead of kindergarten, which might be also another description of the European Union. So let's talk about Zeitenwende. Now, Zeitenwende is in that sense a two-step process. The first of all is acknowledging what is happening at a global level, but also at a very local level, so that we are seeing indeed shifts what is happening in the world, but not only because of recent conflicts. The pandemic has also shown to us that our model of hyperglobalization 1.0 is at its end. Although it was actually never really working, but nevertheless, it's at its end. We see indeed the shifts in our global security, but we see also the shifts more and more happening about climate change is more than some activists' message. It is actually happening. And all this requires response. And this is indeed, and that's the local dimension, to realize what that means in everyday's life. That we are living in times in which you tell to a worker, your job is not needed anymore. And by that, in a society that defines itself via labor, you say, you are not needed anymore. That you have young families in times of small interest rates that were investing into the dream of a small house where interest rates are now rising and more require from them. You have to invest additionally, and they don't know how to survive. Old people that are getting older, but financial products that are not adapting to it, but saying you don't get any loan anymore in order to do all this. So we have those changes at the global level that we have to realize, and we have the challenges, what that means in everyday life, we have to realize. And the second step is then indeed Zeitungen. It means to see this is what is happening, and that means we have to stop doing things as we did them in the past. And like always when we do this, there's a lot of resistance because you're used to something and you think because you're used to it, it's better how it was. But the future requires a different kind of acting, a different vision on what is our internal market. It's not passive anymore, but it must be active, it must be out, it must protect our production standards. We have to see how we position ourselves globally, etc. And that is the capacity to act.
And I'd be interested to hear a little bit later what, among those many, many issues, what you think will really be driving voters' decisions, what will be in their minds during the campaign and when they go to vote. But we'll come back on that. Antonius, to help to build this picture still of the challenge and what you see as the key questions we need to answer, because there are differences of emphasis, a common thread in what Sergei and René have said, but differences of emphasis there.
Yeah, there is a common thread, and I have to agree with that. We are facing challenges that we did not face 15 years ago, which was the last time that we updated our institutional capacity to act. We live in a different world, and even if we go further back into time, the EU was never created to be able to respond to successive crises. Crisis after crisis for decades in a row. The EU is a fascinating political experiment or political entity, one for the history books for sure, but it was created during a different period, during a different world. Again, if you look back at the last institutional update that we had, 2007, we're talking about a world that didn't have any smartphones or drones or reusable rockets or social media networks and so on. A world where we were still living under the illusion of the end of history, so the liberal European values were undisputed around the world, and now we see the exact opposite. Our values are, the liberal democratic values are doubted even within the continent. We would never expect that 15 years ago. Add to that the successive crises, add to that all the technology developments that are changing our everyday life, and you get a picture of a union that is not able to act, and a lot of challenges that need to be taken care of at the same time. Now, this is not a criticism, this is just to say that we have to think about it and change it very fast.
I want to come back to that question of the institutional capacity to act a little bit later on, and it will inevitably bring up the question, Lenka already mentioned it, of treaty change or not. But before we get there, Corinna, complete the picture of us in terms of the challenge, and perhaps now we could already begin to drill down into what you think the big issues will be in the European elections. And would your answer be the same? Do you think it will still be on those societal challenges we've been talking about, and reference has been made to demography, to climate change, to many challenges, but has the geopolitical environment changed that, the mood, the atmosphere, and therefore will it change the campaigns, do you think?
Well, thank you very much, Jackie, and good evening, everyone. I will disappoint you in a sense because I do agree with my fellow panelists. And what I'd say is that indeed I don't think there is one specific challenge, internal or geopolitical, that the EU is facing that is more important or bigger than the next one. And I think I agree that in reality the problem is precisely that the EU is facing multiple complex and interrelated challenges that are coming, on a rolling basis. And those challenges are not only, linked to the modern drivers of transformative change, like we've heard, inequality, shrinking and aging societies, climate change, digitalization, global economic shifts. It's not only that. It's all of that, but hand in hand with, many of the crises that have taken place over the past years, linked to economy, immigration, COVID, populism, and now the war. And then, of course, we can't exclude, which none of which are gone, by the way. We still are dealing with them, or with the consequences of them. And of course, nobody can preclude the fact that new challenges are coming up, and there's many more black swans that we could be facing in the future. So all of this then poses the problem that it's not just the scope and the scale of these challenges that is concerning, but also the fact that they are so interrelated that in reality dealing with one can have a cascade of unintended consequences on other policy fields. And so the problem is that we have so many trade-offs and hard decisions, choices that we're facing. And this means that the identification of the problem is difficult because it's not only a pragmatic, but also a political problem.
But it's also a problem in the minds of voters. Because faced with these multiple challenges, and Lenka made a point when she was talking about the EU's relevance perhaps has become more obvious as a result of the pandemic, of the wars in Ukraine, in Gaza, and the situation we find ourselves in. And she was saying maybe that will be enough to make voters see this as more than a protest vote. But the temptation among voters will be to say, amidst this complexity, I feel powerless, I feel disempowered, and those predictions of a big surge in support, for example, for far-right parties, will come true precisely because of what you're describing. I know you want to come in, Antonius, but let me just follow that up with Corinna briefly. If you
yes, that's precisely it, but I think it's not only for the voters, it's also for politicians themselves, because the decision-making has to adapt to a world of uncertainty, to a world of unpredictability, to the world in which one has to think perhaps of the priorities, whether it's the future that matters or the immediate costs that matter. So it's a change of perspective. And also when you do policy making now, you have to think of policies across silos. You have to think of transdisciplinarity of the issues. So it's not just citizens that need to wrap their heads around it, but also politicians. And this has implications for the way you talk. You do campaigns, you run campaigns, because it's no longer about going to the voters and trying to convince them that decisions are win-win anymore. You have to take policy stances, and you have to present the trade-offs to them. And people understand that. And for them, they see the trade-off as well on basically all of the issues.
So a question to all of you, do you think that changes the way your parties will campaign in these elections? And what do you think will be uppermost in voters' minds when they go to the polls? Antonius, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I cannot talk about, I'm not representing a political party.
Indeed not.
Yes. But I could give some suggestions or advice to political parties. That is my role. And I want to say that indeed the EU has become more relevant. For decades, European integration process was this distant, faraway process that had no actual impact on the lives of citizens. Now, this is a historical change in the last years. This means two things, and both of them are responsibilities. The first one is that it creates a lot of expectations from the citizens, and I think that the relevance that we see now for the EU is the actual genuine feeling of the voters, of the people, that there is something going on here. We need to engage with the EU more. So greater expectations means, and I conclude with that, more responsibility for the EU. And maybe you misunderstood me earlier, but I did think that the institutional capacity to act should be a top priority for the EU.
Indeed.
Because otherwise, all these problems, societal problems, financial problems, industrial policies, we cannot solve them unless we do have an institutional capacity to act. But we can come back to that.
No, absolutely. And I want to come back to that in a little while. I just want to focus on the campaigns first. René, you'll be out campaigning, knocking on doors. speaking in the streets. Do you feel in this context that we are in now, what will you be trying to address when you talk to the voters? And when we talk, and let's link these things together, because all of these issues have led to, and if we look at opinion polls at the moment, widespread predictions that the far right are going to do very well, that they might indeed, that the ECR and ID groups might between them have something like a quarter of the seats in the parliament. Do you share that concern? I mean, I'm aware that I've moderated debates on elections where this has come up before, and the fears have proved relatively unfounded. People saying, no, it's different this time. We have a real problem. And if we have a real problem, how can mainstream parties counter it?
Well, if the far right is growing, then indeed we have a problem. But let me put it like this. I tend to disagree with the very fact that citizens perceive the EU as more relevant. On the contrary, I think in that sense nothing has changed. It may be a very German perspective, which is then more a midterm election without consequences. Yeah. In a sense that if you go for a national vote, then you basically have in the last consequence, you know, okay, in the end, the party I'm voting to might be the next chancellor. And do I trust this person, if there's ever a crisis, to lead me through this properly? And then you vote reasonably, ultimately. This very last resort is not then in the choice for the European elections. So there's let's say less of a disciplining moment, and moreover the European elections will be on many issues but Europe, I'm afraid. Yet this is this something that I'm lamenting about? I don't want to. Honestly, this is politics, and I have full understanding for citizens' perception of that. Kurt Tucholsky 100 years ago, a German writer, he wrote in 1931, observing the German society, people misunderstand many things, but they feel many things rightly. And so here, so I do believe that there's a sentiment that the EU matters, but it's not understood as such. Is this a problem? I don't think so. So what citizens are looking at, and therefore I like the term capacity, is the capacity to act by the public authorities. They see that decades of neoliberalism have led to unleash private actors doing a lot of nonsense, and they want to have the public to have a capacity to act against it, to steer it, to be there, to protect them, to make them feel safe. And they see this is not happening because municipal authorities don't have the capacity to act anymore. National authorities kill themselves by adopting ridiculous debt breaks. And European capacity is not there because the whole European construction works differently. So I'm totally fine if voters want to vote the Social Democrats or not to vote him because of Chancellor Scholz, because he's part of this big public unity that is supposed to act. But that then requires, as Lenka said in her introductory words, that the mindset in that sense changes, that we have to work as public hand in hand. So what can Europe do in order to strengthen the other levels that are there? If we look at the Capacity Act of the European Union, with an EU budget that is limited to 1.24% of GDP, where half of it is already bound by subsidies for farmers, where we already see, if you touch them, what is happening to our capacity to act. And nevertheless, we have all those challenges to face without member states giving us more money. That's a squaring the circle exercise. And then citizens know, okay, what the heck? Why should I go then even to vote for it? Those that don't like democracy in Europe, they go now vote because they have a party they can vote for that says that I'm against all this.
So just to follow up, how do you counter that?
Oh, I'm countering this. No, I say the whole thing is, and we see this particularly in Germany, where millions are going on the street, because they also feel this is wrong what is happening there. We actually have serious people that are doing business together, irrespective of what we see in everyday's business. So what I'm countering there is, look guys, this is now about going to the ballots and making clear what you want. Those that don't like what we want, they will go there. And in order to motivate them to go there, I have to give them an objective. And this is not copy-pasting what the far right says, but actually offering them more progressive policies and giving them a vision how the state, the public, can get the capacity.
So is part of this campaign, Sergei, also this time going to be about democracy itself? When we talk about what will the campaigns be about, what will you be talking to voters about? What do you think is going to make them decide how to vote? how much will it be a discussion about our future, our values and so on, and how much will it be very much bread and butter issues, cost of living, etc., do you think?
It has to be both, but I think the underlying issue is that we are witnessing a decay of a party democracy. We are in a period of history where party democracy, which I personally prefer as a democratic model, does not deliver, and people and the differences, especially if we're talking now about issues like crises, defense, digitalization, environment. There are less and less, and I'm talking here now because I don't see this event as a party campaign, yeah, right?
No,
or
not at all. No, no.
campaign. We're kind of the preceding.
Exactly.
And on many of those issues, and our European Parliament is very good in this, we are acting across the aisle. And for people and for citizens, it's becoming increasingly difficult to differentiate between different parties, what they stand for. And in a situation like this, the right-wing parties are those who get the profile, who capture kind of with an anti-systemic
It's clear what
platform.
yes, it's clear what
for
they're
them,
saying.
it's clear we are against all of those. And you cannot determine, what is the difference between the two of us. If we're honest, very difficult, I think.
You should see his face if
Not in terms
you're on that side.
of size, but in terms of what we stand for.
Value. You mean in terms of values?
Yeah, and I think that what we're seeing is that the role of personalities are increasing and the role of parties are decreasing. And the challenge of the European elections and the system of European elections, especially in Germany, I don't know, there are preferential votes elsewhere, but in Germany, is that there is no opportunity to present persons. You only present party lists. And that, I think, will be one of the problems that we will be seeing, because it will be very difficult for people to understand why they should cross this or this party, except for coming from a social democratic family, or being and then we're talking about the core voters. But for the right wing, for the disenfranchised, for those where Sarah Wagenknecht is sending her disciples, it's a party with her name on it. This is the personal capacity. These are all people who are her staffers and her devoted disciples. That's about a person. They have a chance, unfortunately, in times of crisis.
So one thing I think I'm hearing from you is that's going to be absolutely key here. We often focus in European elections on the turnout. I think sometimes unfairly when we say, look at the turnout in a European election, and that shows no one cares about European elections, when the turnout often in regional and local elections, and frankly some national elections, can be low. But nevertheless, turnout this time will be crucial, because those who support the far-right parties are more likely to come out to protest. I just want to get a sense, Corinna, from you of how you see, do you think, it's hard to say at this point, but the polls do point to this much more fragmented parliament, as I say, up to a quarter. Being. Now, in the past, the old traditional, Sergei's, look, we really think alike, we can make this work. It's a very pragmatic parliament. Do you think that will prevail nevertheless, even if we do have this bigger faction? Or are those who say, no, this would be a very different parliament, more pro-Russian, more anti-immigration, more, that these are the things that people are saying. Sergei, you look surprised, but this is what people are predicting. Pro-Putin, exactly, thank you. Thank you for correcting me, you're right. Our sacred values will come under threat. Are we really facing a watershed with the results of these elections, or can the centre hold post-election, whatever happens, do you think, Corinna?
Right. Well, I mean, any forecasts will automatically be probabilistic and not deterministic at this point. But I would say that, well, it's up to the center in the end. I mean, there are things that, based on past experience and past research, show that go against those types of parties. I mean, we know already from their behavior and performance in previous legislatures that they tend to be quite fragmented. They don't. They're not very good at taking coordinated action. They have very little in-party cohesion, in-group cohesion. So there are things that go against them, and there's no certainty that they will get along this time and that they will manage to make common front and, you know, break through with their proposals and vision of things. At the same time, we know also from experience that what the risk is that nevertheless their discourse and their position, their surge in their position, could influence mainstream indirectly.
Pushes, yeah.
And that, you know, this means that it will be up, for example, to the EPP to decide whether it wants to break lines with centrist pro-European parties and, you know, decide to come in coalitions or in support of certain radical positions. It's up to them in the end to decide. So will the mainstream allow themselves to be you know, divided and moved into certain cooperations that didn't happen in the past? That's one risk that we're facing. And the other is also that simply their rhetoric and their policy stances could be influenced, their priorities, their level of ambition could be challenged by the mere existence of more of such radical political parties in the parliament, but also at the national level. And so a lot hinges on how the center will behave in the end.
Thank you. Antonius, I'll come back to you in a minute. I just want to get a reaction from our MEPs to how you think the new parliament, if the polls are right, whether you believe the fragmentation in those groups means that actually they won't break through in terms of their influence, or as Corinna says, even if they can't get their act together completely, they will push the agenda more in their direction. Sergei, what do you think?
We'll have to see. You know, we cannot predict everything. What will be difficult, of course, is how to deal with those parties. For now, for example, we have Cordon Sanitaire, which, at least in some groups, which still working. I am a vice chair in the Legal Affairs Committee. I actually should have been a vice chair to a ID chair. This was a committee that actually was drawn by the ID group. This is something that the majority of the committee did not want. And that's why it's a liberal chair now. But I'm not sure if the party is the third strongest in the parliament, how easy and how many committees will have to have this fight. We will be in a different reality also in our parliamentarian life. And we can arrive to different, you know, I'm still convinced that we should have a strong and clear position, but it will be much more, we will be busy with those things instead of talking about other issues. I do see that there is a push, at least among ID parties, to be more, I mean, this is my feeling, to be more coherent in their positions, because they know it's about power. And regarding ECR, we will see how a Polish nationalist party that is no more in power, that's no more in the government, will maybe be more open to work with the Fidesz party because of a different position and different role.
So many different factors in play here. René, would you agree with Sergei? How do you see it panning out? And just before we focus back on the capacity to act, in terms of the focus and whether we do need, I think it was Antonius who said we need to to think in a new way. We need to really have a mindset shift here. Do you think that this new landscape, this new political landscape, is going to really dramatically change the EU's priorities, its focus, or should it?
Yeah, you know, it's what I'm indeed already wondering. It's a kind of Groundhog Day feeling that I'm here on several panels. There's an elephant in the room everybody's talking about, and we are wasting way too much time talking about the ID or the right wings. Yes, they are growing compared to what they were in the past, but still, even with the 20% the AfD gets in the German polls, it means that there are 80% who are not AfD. And also, if you look at those polls, I mean, we have our troubles with the EPP, but the majority of the EPP are clear in their pro-European vision. In practice, at least in many files that relate to the economy, even the ECR is most of the times on board. We find even compromises that go into the ECR. So for the ECR, the question is how much of an ID do they want to become if there are many true Finns who are not true anymore but Finns and then join the ECR? What is about Wilders? If he doesn't like the fascists in the ID, they say also, oh. But that's questions for them. Honestly, I think the capacity to act of the parliament is still there. It will make things a bit more difficult in files where we had this small majority in the past mandate about certain Green Deal files that just went through with the Renew. And this kind of elements. That's not going to happen anymore in that way. But the next agenda of the Commission will also not be Green Deal. In my eyes, it's going to be competitiveness and security. And when we're looking at competitiveness, there are things where the left center and the right center can find common ground to work together in order to solve problems, because the world is what it is. The challenges are on the table. And the most important point for the center parties is to deliver. And if we are just staring at the snake called the ID and don't move anymore, that is precisely the program to make them strong. We say, okay, they are there, they have their voices, they will talk their stuff, not ridiculizing them, they are there, but still we have 80% that are in favor of a pro-European course.
Antonio, I'll bring you in a minute, Corinna, but Antonius, you said earlier, one of your first points was about the questioning of our liberal democratic values. For you, and reacting to what you've heard about predictions of what this all could mean for the shape of the parliament and so on, do you think, in terms of how this should influence the agenda going forward, where do you think the focus needs to be?
I received this article from Politico the other day on my phone, and the title was "The Far-Right Threat This Time is Real," which means immediately the connection in my mind was, okay, so this time is real, but all the previous times was not real. And this has something to say about going into the elections again with creating this dichotomy between us versus them. I would recommend avoiding that. It's a losing strategy. And I say this because I didn't read the article in the end. I was so angry with the title. But I can give you, I can give you my own idea about why this time the threat is real, just to support the conversation.
Yeah.
It's because even the far right understands that they need Europe. And if you focus and observe very carefully their rhetorics in the past years, it's not anti-European anymore. They dislike what is happening here, but they are not against the idea of taking over the establishment. This is what Orban, for example, is saying. We need a counter revolution, or however he frames it. They would like to gain more power, not to dismantle the project, but to use it according to their ideology. And that's exactly what I said, that the threat is not that they are coming here to sabotage everything, not being able to find a ruling majority in the parliament, but you know, they want to change things according to their own ideology, which is, of course, incompatible with...
Mind you, they tend to say what's wrong with what everyone else is doing rather than giving...
I'm not sure what is comforting about this vision.
It's not. That's the real threat.
Corinna.
If I may a bit, because I think it's dangerous to say, well, you know, there's all these issues on which the center agrees, that economic, budgetary, single market issues, and, you know, those matter and we're all going to get along on that. But this is precisely the reason why these parties, this kind of radical parties, thrive, because mainstream parties, pro-European parties, ignore the difficult questions, the difficult conversations that people care about, that they don't speak about the problems, the trade-offs and everything. I mean, on climate change, okay, it might not be the priority of the next commission. I hope it's not the case, but let's say it's no longer the key priority like we've seen it with von der Leyen now. But climate change will not go away. It's still a critical issue with tremendous implications, maybe not for this generation, but certainly for the next ones. It's an issue on which sooner or later we're going to have to come to terms with. And it's an issue about which, if you look at public opinion polls, the citizens care deeply about it. Of course, they have hesitations, they have concerns, but all of this have to be flashed, have to be discussed, have be that you know, glass ceiling where we are worried about having the sensitive conversations has to be broken, and I think it tees up to the mainstream parties to go through that.
Sergei, I think you want to react.
Yeah, I agree with you in substance. I'm not sure that the rise of right-wing parties is because we do not address environmental issues. Those people are...
I think what she was saying was, it's because sometimes you say there are issues we shouldn't talk. I mean, for example, I've heard this often discussed in relation to migration.
Yes.
It's difficult, we don't want to, they're nasty people raising nasty points, so we will just dismiss anyone who raises a concern and not address it. I think that Corinna's saying you're not, you have to be honest.
Yeah,
tiptoeing, exactly.
Is that not? But look at what at our agenda in the European Parliament during the past 5 years. I mean, the issues that we were addressing, from the Mindestlohn, minimum wage.
I know that's
sorry. Yeah, that's the difference. I only know it in German, and he works with it all the time. The Green Deal issues, digitalization issues, these are all issues that are on people's minds. I think we cannot say that we do not address those.
I didn't say that. This is not what I said. I reacted to a hypothesis that in the next legislature, climate issues will anyway become lower in priority, and then there will be scope on economic issues for the center to cooperate. This was the argument that was put forward, or this is what I understood. And in that sense, I think this is dangerous with respect to the radicals.
I just want to come back to this point about expectations and capacity to act, because when you talk about, you know, whether you agree the EU has or has not become more relevant in people's minds, there is this expectation. And if you raise expectations and you don't meet them, then there is a problem. And I just wondered, in terms of having, you mentioned the budget, I think, Sergei, it was you talked about the budget and member states not giving you capacity, René also, to that issue. But also, when we look at issues like completing the single market, capital markets union, all these areas, there are some who say, there's a lot we can't do unless the EU has the capacity to act. It has the tools, it has the resources it needs. And otherwise we raise expectations only to disappoint, and this is reflected in the voters and their protest votes at elections. So, but given that some of these issues are really sensitive, take issues, for example, like tax harmonisation, minimum wage, and so on. They are sensitive issues because they touch on what member states regard as their own preserve. Can the EU square that circle, René, do you think, in terms of not raising expectations it can't meet, or do we have to have an upfront debate about the competences, budgets, resources, and does all this lead us inevitably into that conversation about treaty change?
No, honestly, let's say this is technicalities. I think what matters first is what is actually the citizens' expectation. As I've mentioned earlier, it is my belief that citizens realize that there's an incapacity of the public to act. There is no proper counterweight to the private. When we talk migration, then I think that only a very small minority is openly xenophobic. But they look that the queue, that the waiting list for a place in the kindergarten, coming back to this German word, is just getting longer. Yeah. Is the problem now the migrant or is it the queue? As a social democrat, I say it's the queue. And therefore I want to talk about the queue and how to lower this queue. And the queue has something to do with the state capacity to act and to provide for enough places in kindergartens. Is this something for the European Union to do? Hardly so. But if obviously anybody else in this public hierarchy is not able to act, everybody has a role to play in there. So we have to look from the European Union's perspective as an enabler for those who need to act, that they actually can act. And there Europe has a role to play. Of course, then we can discuss competences and budget, and there's a lot to be said about this, but there's many other things to be done at other levels of the public. But it's ultimately about, do we want to have a strong public hand that goes against things that went wrong in the last 40 years by neoliberalism anywhere and everywhere. So do we want to have regulation that gives the power back to the public authorities, or do we just want to continue this deregulation agenda? So we call it now cutting red tape, but ultimately it's even more of the worse, speaking about expectations. Huh?
Okay, I'm going to come out to all of you in a minute, but just on this question, therefore, if we have, Antonius, this endless debate about treaty change, not treaty change, you're the one who raised more than anyone else the institutional capacity. Do you think, therefore, we have to grab, to use an English expression, this bull by the horns, and we have to deal with it, even though many member states say, don't go there, it's not politically feasible, you can't do it, and you can't get it ratified? Or do you think we should be looking much more in terms of creatively using what we do have? And I'm wondering how you think this whole discussion plays in the voters' minds, if at all.
Well, you tell me. Maybe the audience can tell us, because this is what I'm hearing. We discussed. I'll give you two examples. We discussed specific topics: environmental policies and migration. Only just now. Let's take the environmental policy. Let's take the Green Deal. It's a monumental transformation, societal and economic and industrial transformation plan. Monumental. It doesn't have a social policy aspect in it, because there is not just transition. There is no social policy for a just transition, for this transformation. Not because we don't want to, but because the EU doesn't have competences there. And René said, is this for the EU to do? Maybe not. But if the EU comes with a monumental historical, industrial, social, economic transformation plan of the whole continent, then the same organization needs to give the social policy solutions. It is just, in my view, tragic that we have the Green Deal without the social component fixed into it by the EU. But we need institutional capacity. And I can tell you later...
So should we... To the rest of you, should we be focusing on this question of institutional capacity, or at the moment do our energies, you've all enumerated just how big the challenges are we're facing, do we have to make that part of the answer, the debate about changing our institutions, changing the way we work, or would that be to deflect from really addressing what we can do with what we have? What's your sense? Quick ones.
If you start talking in the election campaign about institutional capacities, you will lose even those who are still awake here. So it's this is not something that we will be discussing.
Post-election.
Post-election, we should talk about that, and we should also talk about transformation of treaty, but it is a visionary long-term perspective. This is not something that we will be able to master very fast. We have plenty of things on rule of law issues, etc., that we would like to change in the treaties. I am not sure this is a matter of the upcoming 5 years, but this is something that we should always repeat so that people start getting, this is becoming a reality and not just a vision.
So don't campaign on it, but keep it there, keep it in that discussion.
Let's put it this way.
René, I saw you.
Yeah, on the contrary. I think the good thing about the election campaign is you have 2 or 3 weeks where people are actually looking at political debates. Huh? So we should use this attention span that we get. And then it is about political will before the election. We need a political will, and then it doesn't matter which institution. What annoys me in Brussels extremely, given the very fact that I'm a trained law professor, is whenever you don't like the politics, you say it's legally not possible, and then you get the treaty change debate. Highly annoying. No, that's not what it is. If you want to have it politically, then you can get it done. If there's a lacking social dimension, fine. Then go to the Stability and Growth Pact and don't talk about safeguards, but about enabling social policies at the national level. If you see that there are highly indebted states who cannot afford it, then talk about fiscal capacity. So you can do things without treaty change, but it's about political will. So don't hide behind the law and the treaty change just because there's no political will. But if on the ballot it's social democracy in Europe, Germany, Länder level, and at the municipalities, and that's one message, this is our political will, irrespective of the legal hurdles. That is precisely what it's about.
I thought we're not doing election campaign.
But can't resist it. He's a politician. So
I can do this too, you know.
Sorry, Antonius.
Exactly. I wanted to agree. I couldn't agree more, actually, because it's not everything about treaty change. The way the Commission works, for example, we don't need a treaty change to change the workflow of the Commission to avoid silos or to make sure that there is enough expertise when they are, creating the first legislative proposals and so on. So
there's a lot we can do without getting
that.
into that debate. Quick one, if you would, Corinna, because I want to go out to the room.
Yeah, I do have 4 points. First, to say treaty change also has to be sort of unpacked, because you can have treaty change as a big package, a big bang thing through with a convention and, a very lengthy, tedious process. You can also have treaty change that takes different rounds, and that entails a different kind of process. So when we speak about treaty change, one has to be more specific about what we mean by it. The second thing to say is Conference on the Future of Europe and citizens. And if you just look at that, because somebody wondered about what people want, well, if you look at what came out of that conference, the citizens were a lot more ambitious than politicians normally are, and actually a lot of their proposals can be linked and were linked by experts to possibility of treaty change. Third point is to say that EP elections, and given competencies, because we raised the issue of competencies, Parliament's competencies are not necessarily on deciding the future of Europe. That decision lies more in the Council, and so perhaps the European Parliament elections are not the best place where to have this kind of campaigns, but basically, whether you have them or not, we should remember that the Parliament, if we talk about it, the Parliament has been extremely bold and ambitious recently, and several proposals coming from the Parliament actually propose quite substantial fundamental reforms, including the possibility of treaty change.
Briefly,
and then,
if you would, on
yes,
your fourth.
And then the fourth point, yes, it is a problem of political will, which is linked to multiple fears. Multiple fears at the member states level about their prerogatives, about their relevance, about the future, and also that fear sometimes spills over in the institutions, where institutions as well, and their level of ambition differs. So this makes for the prospect of treaty change and reform a complicated conversation, and I would say that it's postponing it won't necessarily help. And maybe we should have a roadmap and a plan for the next years already spelled out.
And you mentioned the Conference on the Future of Europe. It is striking how that has disappeared from the discourse almost entirely, it seems, after such a big exercise. Any burning... I want to come, because before we end, to the potential, the actual role of insurers in all of this. You mentioned some of the ways in which you can play a role. I would like to get a reaction from you, and then also to identify your priority for the next 5 years. So put you on the spot in a minute. Any burning questions from any of you? Can I ask you to introduce yourself and please be brief?
Sure. So can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
I'm Paolo Barone from the Luxembourgish Insurance Association. About the treaty change, I wanted to ask, personally, I think that the main problem with the institutional set right now is unanimity, especially in the European Council. So my question is, for instance, in foreign policy, how do you think that the European Commission, the EU in general, could ever face the challenges that we see every day right now and in the future with still having unanimity as a decision-making system?
Thank you very much. Let me see if there are any more in the interests of time. Yes, please.
Right here, and I'm Wolfgang, I'm with German Public Insurance, the second largest private insurance group in Germany. And I apologize for being a bit provocative, but I will start with a German proverb which says that it is better to have an end with horse than horse without end. And against this backdrop, my provocative...
Sorry, it's better to have an...
End with horse than having horse without end.
Right.
There's no real... Yeah. It's
Horror.
better to have an end that comes with some horrors
It's
than having
about
horrors
horrors in
coming
in
with
German
end,
proverbs,
yeah.
you know.
So having endless horrors. That's the beauty of the German language. Some might understand and know what I'm meaning about. But I mean, against this backdrop, and that explains also the question, has the time maybe come to just let these guys assume the powers they deserve according to the words and let them prove themselves that they are stupid morons who just cannot deliver? So why... yes, why?
Okay, okay. I mean, that is, when we come to the cordon sanitaire argument, that is often the argument. Give them the power, and then they show what they don't do with it, as it were. Quick reactions on the unanimity question and on that. Who would like to come in? Sergey.
This is precisely why I'm talking a little bit about the long-term issue of reforms, and institutional reforms and treaty reforms. Because if we are talking here indeed about the geopolitical agenda of expansion, and the expansion that we're talking about now is mostly framed in geopolitical terms. So Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, why are we talking about them? Balkans. You always get there because of the confrontation with Putin, with Kremlin. And that's why the Polish and the Baltic states are so keen on that. I agree and I support this completely. The problem that I have is that we are losing sight of the fact that the EU is still a value-based mechanism, and the commonness of the values is getting lost. We're not a NATO without army, right? We're much more than that. So that means that we will have to think about rethinking of how we get, how we work together while we're talking about expansions. And this will only be possible if we start talking at some point about treaty changes in a longer perspective.
And essentially a cordon sanitaire related question, René, in terms of just put them in charge, going back to our discussion about far-right party, about populists, and
they
let
might
them
support
minimum
minimal wage. They might support minimum wage,
He's trying to provoke you here.
What shall I say? There are many laws that were adopted in 1933 and 1939 that are still in place and gave a social advancement of Germany. It doesn't take away that the same party was starting the Second World War and committed the Holocaust. So therefore, yeah, I can see the fun of it, but I have difficulties to laugh.
No, absolutely.
And that is in that sense my answer to this. As it was in the 1920s, when everybody was laughing at Mein Kampf about what kind of weird language, what kind of weird plans. Okay, give Hitler the power and he will prove that he's not going to make it. We saw how that works. Obviously, he couldn't make it, but the price was quite high to pay. So we should start in politics by taking the words that are said seriously, taking remigration seriously, and deportation, what it ultimately means, taking it seriously what those people say and afterwards then say, oh, it wasn't meant like this. No, it was meant like that, full stop. Okay. So if they get the power, they will use the power. And this is no fire I want to play with. Then we have an endless horror if we want to stay in this kind of thing. So we have a responsibility in that.
Can I just ask, I'm going to limit this question just to our two MEPs, because we're talking a lot about what you need to do and how you need to respond to the challenges we face and how you maybe will need to operate in this new environment post-election. But just to come back, as many of the people in this room are from the insurance sector, we talked earlier about the societal challenges, we talked about cost of living, we've talked about climate change a great deal. Do you see a role for this sector, both in terms of what they do? There is an obvious role related to climate change, and not just coverage of risk, but also climate adaptation, mitigation, and so on. There's also a role for them as investors. Do you think, when we look particularly, Sergey, at the green transition, that this sector has a role to play? And if so, what do you want from them? What more do they need to do in terms of coming up with the sort of innovative solutions that we're going to need to face all of these challenges?
I'm not sure about the role. I mean, it's not up to us to say what role the voters should play, but I am worried about that, and maybe in on a different occasion we could really go into this. That if we don't stop climate change, and if we cannot master the risks that we're talking about here, that it will become at some point not insurable. And then we're having a real problem. Yeah. And of course, the issues, the innovative issues that we're discussing also in the Legal Affairs Committee or elsewhere, for example, the liability of artificial intelligence is also something where we should have an exchange and go hand in hand, because this is a new turf. In many of those technologies, we are facing totally new constellations regarding distribution of risks, realization of risks, etc. And I think we also should be humble on our behalf that we cannot see and know everything. That's why I do not belong to those who like scold at the lobbyists. I think this is a discussion and a dialogue also with industry and civil society is something where we can also learn from each other, because the challenges that we're facing will be our joint challenges, common challenges.
And René, you were talking a lot about the social challenges that we face when it comes to issues like old age demography, but also old age poverty and growing inequalities and so on. Do you believe that a sector like this can play a role? Is there something you would want from them? Because we always tend in Brussels debates to put all our demands on the policymakers. So I'm just trying to turn it round for a moment here and say sectors like this that play a crucial role in these areas, is there more they can do?
No, yeah, the thing is the insurance sector is, I think, a very important one for this debate, because it's the very raison d'etre of an insurer to mitigate risks to the extent possible. At times we must realize if there's a risk, it will not disappear. The question is only who is the one who is going ultimately to pay for it and how many. And here the insurers are playing the core role. Sometimes they have a better feeling about the risks that are out there than we have, because it's ultimately the business model that they have to look at. So therefore it's important to indeed listen to the insurance sector to see, okay, what are you detecting out there? At the same time, of course, speaking about poverty, there are insurance products which are made for that in order to mitigate the risk of getting old in poverty. But they remain a private business, so they cannot excuse the public from doing their job to address the fundamental risks of life. So I do see also the public that is in there and the private that comes on the top of it. But there's, of course, thirdly, there's a lot of capital that is moved by insurers. And moving capital is never apolitical. So there is also a responsibility in how to invest. And that's, of course, an old debate that we have had the last years, and that is going to be there, speaking about the broader topic of sustainable finance and which role then insurers as financial market operators play in there. I personally believe, and that is quite known, that they can play a better role than they are currently doing, without ignoring that they are already playing that role, and that there are also many things going wrong in sustainable finance regulation, setting wrong incentives, so that we also have to do our part in it. But I do believe that, say, steering the capital stock that there is into a right direction is core. We all see what we need in order to get the green and digital transition done is public investments, but not only. We need to have private investments, and them even more, and they have to be launched into the right direction. We want to try to do our part in it, but ultimately it's insurers that have to go the same way, yet they have a certain task and a business model, and that must align. And that is where the challenge lies.
Thank you very much. Okay, we are almost out of time, and a good moderator never keeps people from their drinks. But I do want to put you all on the spot and ask each of you, and Antonius, I'll start with you, then I'll go to Corinna, and then I will come back to René and to Sergey. And this is probably an impossible question to answer, but I'm really trying to identify for each of you, as we move into this election period, as we move into the discussion on the new commission, its political makeup, its work programme, And you talked, all of you, about those multiple, complex, interlinked challenges. If you had to identify, as we go into a new 5-year cycle, one thing above all else that we need to do, and whether it links to our debate about the threat to democracy itself or to issues, what for each of you is your overarching priority post-election come November, when all the musical chairs that Brussels loves so much are over and things settle down? Where does the focus need to be? Antonius first. Impossible question, I know, but it's...
I guess that every single person in this room will guess what I am about to say, because I mentioned it so many times, and I have to insist that in order to solve all those problems, we need to reform the EU. Now, if it's going to be a treaty change, if it's going to be some sort of streamlining the institutional cooperation or interinstitutional cooperation, if we are going to reform the working of the parliament, the different committees, in order to be more able to respond. But I have to insist, if it's not institutional capacity, then it is something to mitigate the risks, the social repercussions of all these plans that we have introduced in the past.
Thank you. Corinna.
Okay, I'll link two issues that came up during the discussion. So we heard that about the geopolitical imperative of enlargement, but I would add to what we've just heard now that there is a geopolitical imperative also for EU reform. Whether enlargement or not happens geopolitically, given all the challenges that we discussed, we are in a situation where the EU needs to reform. But I would link that reform to enlargement. I do it partially because it's part of my portfolio, but I do it also because I do think that enlargement opens up discussion about so many other issues that are linked to so many other problems. It links to the rule of law, it links to budget, it links to security, it links to social issues, it links to climate. So I would say that pursuing these two aspects, these two important issues, enlargement and reform in parallel, would be a good entry point and a good focus for the work of the new leadership. And I think it would pay off, because we are at a point where we need to rebuild trust with our allies, where we don't trust them to reform and they don't trust us to reform. So if on both sides we start making progress, we make a little bit of progress on enlargement and we make a little bit of progress in reform, and we find way to sort of bounce off each other, I think this can bring us a long way forward towards getting the EU in a position where it's better equipped to weather whatever challenges we need to face. And I say this without undermining, of course, the other big challenges that we discussed. But it is one entry point. Yeah.
Thank you. René.
Yeah, obviously it gets then a little bit abstract. So I would call it innovation and justice. We need to have an industrial policy that is progressive and unleashes the powers of innovation. We have no fiscal capacity to keep up with the Americans or the Chinese, but we have a lot of excellent brains here, yet structures and ways in which innovation is not properly taking place. So we need to unleash the powers of innovation. And this has to be done by this has to be joined by redistributive policies to create this social air that is so much needed, because currently Europe is perceived as a project of strong elites that doesn't have the redistributive element into it. So we need to combine the creation of a new wave of innovation with redistributional policies.
Sergey.
I think it's going to be European resilience. Our ability to mitigate the risks, face the risks in defense, in climate, and in technology. And by doing so, still remain true to ourselves. That's the resilience. Resilience means you always come back to yourself. And that's going to be challenged. And there we need capacities to strengthen that. And that means also strengthening our ability to determine our ways without relying on over-relying on technology from abroad in sensitive areas. We are talking about the chips production, and this is just one issue. We will have to talk about what kind of supply chains, how we correct a little bit. So this is a whole array of issues, but I think this will be the core question, including our ability to sustain the upcoming climate changes and try to mitigate them and to decrease them. This is something that personally is my challenge and my goal in the upcoming 5 years.
Will you join me in thanking our panel very much indeed for a great discussion? Thank you so much. I wish we had twice as long because there were so many issues I wanted to explore with you. But thank you for a brilliant discussion. And now, on behalf of GDV, thank you to all of you for coming. Great to have so many of you here and watching us online. Apologies to those online for what I'm about to say, because those who are here with us are very welcome to join for a drink. They are served outside. If you're watching online, go and grab yourself a drink at home. Thank you very much indeed, and have a great evening. Bye-bye.